climate change wasn't something that was really addressed a lot in fiction. Now I think there's a genre people talk about, cli-fi.
Cli-fi.
It was a lot of fun to write that character. He's a builder who you immediately feel should not be in possession of power tools, because they're just...
I found Dicky fascinating. He's burying his true self.
If you grew up in the 90s in Ireland, it was very, very conservative. And to be gay, it was this scandalous thing. It was just a bad thing. You were a bad person.
Not to be spoken about at that.
Yeah, exactly. It would be the shame of the family.
Okay, so we have to talk about the ending. Hello.
Hey, Dua, how are you?
I am so excited to talk to you. I've been dying to have this conversation ever since I read The Bee Sting. I took it with me when I was doing some of my summer shows. And usually I take about 4 or 5 books with me when I'm on my travels. But this one felt stocky enough that all I needed was just to take this one and it would get me through the shows. And I just loved it. I thought it was such an epic book. And I guess to summarize it, it's this family saga set in modern Ireland. It tells the story of the Barnes family through 4 main characters, which I loved. I felt like I was really in the psyche of each character, and I felt like you did that so amazingly. And that's the story of the mother Elda, and the father Dicky, the 18-year-old Cass, and her 12-year-old brother PJ. And it worked perfectly because you nailed the voices so much. I felt like the book had everything, love and loss and grief and kind of thriller and sometimes laugh out loud funny. And I feel like there's also this constant looming sense of climate crisis running through the book in the background. And I feel like there's a lot to unpick. So I think let's just jump right in, if that's okay with you.
Go for it.
Okay, so to start us off, could you give us your summary of the book? What is it? What story were you hoping to tell? And when and how did this idea come to you?
I came to the book after working on a screenplay for a while. And so I spent a couple of years not writing fiction. And I got quite anxious about it. And when I'd finished the screenplay, I imagined screenplay writing as being easier than fiction writing, but it turned out to have all kinds of incredibly complicated restrictions. And I was really eager to get back into writing, but I went down a few kind of false paths before I got to The Bee Sting. I had these 3 different ideas, and I couldn't decide which one I wanted to do. One of the ideas was kind of the easiest idea to write, which I thought was the one I would go for, was going to be like a romantic comedy set in Trinity College in Dublin, and there was going to be a boy from Dublin and a girl from a Midlands town called Cass. And I did a huge amount of prep for it. I sort of plotted out all of the, the scenes, the whole arc of the story I had down. But when I came to write it, I found that when I actually sort of put pen to paper, it just didn't interest me. It takes so long to write a book, and it's such sort of a marathon that you really have to be, there has to be something about it that is kind of keeps you invested and keeps you excited. And this sort of a comedy didn't feel emotionally to resonate with where I was at that point. But I really liked this character of Cass, and I was kind of intrigued by her. And I started to kind of think about her backstory. And in this original idea, she had this dad who was a farmer who'd kind of become a prepper. And initially that was kind of a comic idea. I thought of that as a comic idea. But as I began to think about Cass more deeply and her family and, where she lived, the town where she lived, and what kind of situation her father might be in, then the prepping took on sort of more kind of sinister overtones. It's set in 2014. There was a huge financial crisis.
Yeah, the Celtic Tiger.
So the Celtic Tiger crashed spectacularly, and so the family has this car business. The Celtic Tiger, which is so Ireland was when I was a kid was just a poor country that everybody left. You would go to London, or you'd go to New York, or you'd go to Frankfurt, wherever it might be, but you wouldn't stay in Ireland. There was nothing going on. And then in the 90s, there was this huge influx of cash. All these American companies, big banks and pharma companies arrived and set up, and suddenly it became just like almost overnight this incredibly wealthy country. But then, equally almost overnight, it just all the money just sort of disappeared in 2008, and everybody was beached.
Crazy.
The first thing everybody did during the Celtic Tiger was go out and buy a new car. So if you were a car dealer in the 90s, you made a lot of money. But by the same token, when the crash came, the car dealers were really the worst affected. And the crisis went on and on and on and on until 2014. So that's where that's when the book is set. So Dicky, the dad, has just about managed to keep this business and his family on the road. But now finally everything's just starting to come apart. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got these narrators, 4 different voices, 4 totally different perspectives, yet each is as believable as the other. You know, like I said, I really felt like I was listening to, I don't know, a 12-year-old boy or an 18-year-old girl. It's so spot on. I feel like the neuroses that teenagers have, the things that they find cringe. But I also found that it was never condescending, you know. What I was wondering is what character for you was the hardest to crack?
I guess the hardest one was Elda. That's the voice I'm proudest of. So she's the mom in the book. Yeah. And she's from a very different background to the rest of the family. Like, it's a very kind of wealthy middle-class family who've never really known want. But she comes from this much poorer background, like an abusive, violent background. And she's a very different character to anyone I've written before. But I found that, like, so the way that section works is like there's not a huge amount of punctuation, which some people find confusing. But that's just the way it kind of came out. It felt like when I started writing this initially, I was punctuating her part as normal, but it just felt like out of sync with the way she would think and the way she would see things. Like she's someone who's on the run, who feels like life is just coming at her, and she's just trying to kind of just survive from moment to moment. And I really wanted to kind of capture that. So she speaks in this kind of, it's like kind of a rush, you know, but it's quite rhythmic at the same time. Of all of the characters, that's probably the part I'm proudest of, is Imelda's section, because she feels things very deeply, and she's got a very rich kind of emotive kind of sense of what the world is, and she's got a certain kind of intelligence or insight that the other characters, I think, don't have. At the same time, like, writing's such a crazy game, you know, because you spend so long working on these things without anybody seeing them. So I'd written the Imelda section, and I thought like, wow, I'm really proud of that section. I think that section works. But as soon as I emailed it to my editor, I immediately thought, what if it doesn't work? I have no idea if it works or not. I'm not a 35-year-old. You know, this is I could have just got it completely wrong. So it's very gratifying to hear that it sounds authentic, and especially that it's not condescending.
No, it's brilliant. I mean, I love all the characters, but you're right. Imelda's character does have such different depth, especially when you read Cass's part first, and you have a very different idea of what her mum is like, and then you get into Imelda's part, and then you understand her much deeper. I think I love that, and I want to make sure that we talk about each of the characters. So I guess let's follow the order in the book and start with Cass. You know, she's got attitude and back chat that you'd expect from an 18-year-old. She can't wait to escape her small town. She's convinced that her parents know nothing. And yet she's deeply insecure and a bit lost. Tell us more about her.
Yeah, so that's where I started. I'd written a book about teenage boys in a boarding school called Skippy Dies, and I really felt like, you know, that particular well was empty, you know, but I was really interested. There was one teenage girl character in that book, and just kind of, she had a brief chapter of her own, and I thought there was so much going on there. Like a teenage girl's life is so, I mean, there's so many similarities to a boy's life in terms of the vulnerability you feel and your sense of just, lostness. trying to find like a footing for yourself, or trying to find an identity that will carry you forward. But there's all kinds of things that are different. Like there's this. So Cass she's a bright girl, but at the same time she feels very insecure in herself. She's got this friend called Elaine who seems perfect. You know, Elaine, like everything, all her clothes fit her perfectly. She always looks amazing. All the boys like her, and she just knows what to do. You know, and if she walks into a room, like, or a pub or whatever it might be, she just knows like what to do. Whereas Cass is just always kind of floundering. She feels, and Cass has this kind of, it's a friendship that sort of borders on obsession with Elaine, and perhaps maybe even something more than that. Maybe she's got sort of these feelings that she won't acknowledge to herself for Elaine, and the friendship is kind of toxic because Elaine's quite dominating, and Cass, she really needs to become herself. But she doesn't have the confidence to do that. And I guess what I was trying to get at in the book was that, well, I guess we'll come to talk about Dicky the dad in a while.
Yeah.
But the whole family is founded on concealment, and the parents have kind of concealed how the marriage began and how the family began. And as a result of that, the kids themselves, and Cass in particular, although they don't know anything about the family's history, she too sort of feels this need to kind of conceal who she is. She feels this kind of this deep shame about who she is, and that there's a wrongness about her that she has to hide away, and that's kind of toxic to everybody around her. So that's where she is at the start of the book, and she's got a journey. She wants to get out of the small town, which is, if you're a teenager in particular, is like a very claustrophobic place to be.
Yeah.
Because it's a place where, you know, everybody knows who you are and everybody knows your entire family history, and you're just sort of like kind of a dot on the family tree as far as anyone else is concerned.
I found it interesting, you know, the relationship between Cass and Elaine. I feel like, you know, having been a teenage girl once, and also, you know, understanding the dynamics between friendships and wanting to be accepted, and, you know, having had friends also who have been dominating in certain ways and you wanting to be accepted by them. I just really, I understand also Cass's perspective of how hard it is maybe to let go of those relationships. But I did pretty much like punch the air when Cass tells Elaine that she hates her towards the end. I found it so relatable. You know, for her, it was just a very transformative moment. And I think that happens in, you know, every teenager's life at some point, you know, when you realize that something no longer serves you and you need to like let go of it in order to grow. I love that. So next up is PJ, and PJ is 12 and he's at an age which is pretty much caught somewhere between sweets and porn, I guess. He's so resolutely cheerful. He desperately wants everyone and everything to be okay. And I think that kind of goes back to that thing of, even though the kids don't really know the family history, like you can always feel when something's happening in your household, you know, you'll always feel an energy and you're inherently connected to the ones around you, you know. So he always wants, you know, everyone and everything to be okay. He's very trusting. He trusts his sister to like fix things between his mom and dad, but she sends him away. He trusts Ethan, his online friend, which also kind of results in some really terrifying moments. I think for me, that was quite, like a very nerve-wracking moment to read in the book. He also trusts his dad to keep the family safe. He just seems to be desperately searching for connection. Tell us about PJ.
Yeah, so PJ is in some ways kind of like the heart of the book, in that he's a believer. Like everybody else in the family, it's a very wealthy family and they've always had lots of money and lots of stuff. But as that facade crumbles when the money sort of runs out, it doesn't seem to the others that there's anything left that's worth saving. But PJ believes, like PJ wants the family to stay together. He wants his parents to stay together. And like he loves Cass. Like Cass she's kind of grown past him. Like they used to be really close, and now she's on her way to college, and she's going to be gone. And PJ's he's just trying to wants everybody to be happy, like you say. And it was a lot of fun to write that character because he's got that, like, just, you nailed it there. Like, he's just at this really interesting kind of cusp where he's just like, because, that age, like 12, you've got your foot in either camp where, you still believe in Santa Claus, but at the same time, you've become aware of, like, all of these, like,
totally.
He's got by virtue of having a phone, like, all of these terrifying things are coming at him. And like Cass, I guess he's lost. Like, each of the characters is trying to find something they can hold on to because their parents don't seem able to do that for them. So PJ's got this he's got this terrible real life friend called Nev, who's this kind of like dreadful, kind of porn obsessed, horrible kid, who just all he wants to do is play video games, and he kind of despises PJ because he knows PJ needs him more than he needs PJ. But then he's got this mysterious online friend called Ethan, who's just like the opposite of Nev, super nice, always there, always saying, come up to Dublin and we'll hang out. Like, we live like right next door to the zoo. My dad's got a Maserati. We should drive that around to some McDonald's and a KFC on our street. It's amazing. And PJ, because he's kind of at that point where he's clued in enough to go, this seems like a little bit too perfect, but also he's a kid and he's going,
This sounds great. Also,
he's my buddy.
He's my saving grace in some way where I can hide out when everything is going.
He can run away, exactly.
Yeah.
So it seems like he gets this crazy plan, like whereby if he runs away, then his family will be so worried that when they get him back, they'll think, well, let's never, like, all of our problems, we're just going to put them to one side because we've got our priorities wrong. So in some ways, like, there's a logic to it, but like a sort of a 12-year-old logic. Yeah. But obviously, it's not as it seems, and he gets in a bad place.
Yeah. I loved his character. Again, it was just I felt so true, and so poignant to that age, when you're really figuring it out. Okay, Imelda, it dazzled me. I think if the book belongs to one character, I think it's Imelda, and I guess she is the title character. I guess she is the bee sting. I loved the contrast between how she's seen through Cass's eyes as someone who's shallow and frivolous, and then in reality, when she tells her own story, you hear about the desperate poverty that she was raised in, her drunk and violent father, her agonizing grief for her fiancé Frank, and I guess there's a line that really stayed with me when she's remembering her childhood, and it says, "What's for breakfast? Nothing. What's for dinner? Nothing." And in many ways, she's a tragic character, but she's so much more than that, isn't she?
Yeah. So the way the book works is you got the two kids telling their story first, and you see the parents through their eyes, and they've got this very reductive view of their parents. As you do when you're young. Your parents firstly seem like they've got no past. They just sort of were kind of hanging around waiting to have you. Yeah. And prior to that, they may have, had a moustache at some point or something like that. But that's basically as far as it. So I wanted it to feel like when you got to Imelda's section and you discover that she is a real person and she does have a past, and the past is still looming large in the kids' lives. I wanted it to feel like a real change. That said, I mean, you make all these plans when you're working on something, but then when you're actually writing it, like, just all of these new ideas come up and all these new directions come up, and it really feels like, if it's working, it feels like the character is telling you the story, and all you have to do is listen.
Amazing.
And that's really the way it was with Imelda. Like as I said before, like, she's quite a different character to anyone I've tried to write about before. The person she is now is she's made such compromises, or she's had such a difficult journey to get to the seemingly shallow person she is now. So so the big discovery we make about Imelda when we go into her past, it's all set in the present until you get to Imelda's section, and then there's this long flashback, and for the first time you go into the past. She has this. She grew up in this, like, terrifying house, dominated by her dad, who's sort of an ex-prize fighter, and now he's on disability, and he just sort of sits on his couch drinking cans and watching videos of his glory days. And he's a very volatile person, and he's very protective of Imelda in this quite creepy way.
In a weird
he sort
way,
of because she's very beautiful.
Beautiful,
and
exactly.
he sees her as his meal ticket. He says she's going to be the Rose of Tralee someday. And then she meets this boy, just as her father would have dreamed. Like she meets this boy called Frank, who turns out to be from this very wealthy family, and they fall in love. And it's this we see it all from Imelda's perspective, and from that perspective, it's this very it's like a fairy tale romance. Like Frank he's this football hero, and he's very handsome, and he's generous, and he's funny, and he's in love with her. And it's just for however long the relationships last, her life is transformed in this beautiful way where she's elevated, as love will do, into this higher realm. And then he dies in his car crash. And she's devastated. And her life takes this dark turn where she meets Dicky, who's Frank's brother. And Dicky's very different to Frank. Dicky's very kind of quiet and reserved and bookish. But he wants to take care of Imelda. Each of them sees fragments of what they've lost in the other. So there's a moment where Imelda looks into Dicky's eyes at the wake. The family has this wake for Frank, and Imelda just can't deal with it. It's just too much. But then she meets Dicky, and Dicky sort of kind of tidies her up. She's getting sick, and she looks in his eyes and she sees fragments of Frank, the man she's lost. And Dicky sees her, and when he looks at her, she's the only person who can understand what he's feeling, which is this
grief.
This kind of unspeakable, unprocessable grief. So the two of them kind of clutch onto each other like they're refugees from a shipwreck or something, and they stay together. And that decision to stay together, to try and preserve each other, it turns out to have ramifications that Imelda's not aware of, because Dicky's not the person that she thinks he is. He's got this past himself, and he's got these things that he's given up himself.
So I guess now that we've touched on Dicky a little bit, let's talk about him. Imelda's husband, but not her true love. And like you said, there's so much more to his story. So I guess we find out that she's not his true love either. And I found Dicky fascinating. He's dependable, slightly hangdog family man, who in reality is harboring quite a lot of corrosive secrets. In a way, he's kind of become a ghost of himself, burying his true self, his academic dreams at Trinity, his young love for Willie. You talked about concealment earlier. And it's almost like that, like the very fact of what he thinks other people want him to be is what's kind of creating this really terrible situation he's in. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, well, that's it exactly. Yeah, I mean that's a great description of Willie, of Dicky rather. He's a tragic figure, I guess. That's how I see him. He's very talented, and when he's a kid, Frank is the sporting genius and who everybody loves, and Dicky's this kind of nerd, but he goes off to Dublin to study in Trinity, and suddenly this whole new world opens up to him. Like for a start, he's surrounded by all these similarly clever people, but then he meets a boy called Willie, and he discovers that he's completely refused to accept the person he is until this moment when he meets Willie, and he falls in love with Willie. But he feels unable to reveal that love to his family. Like if you grew up in the 90s in Ireland, like Ireland was it was a theocracy. It was just it was dominated by the church. It was very, very conservative, and to be gay, I mean, I think homosexuality was decriminalized in like 1993. I think. But even past that, it was this scandalous thing. It was just a bad thing. You were a bad person. Not to be
spoken about at that.
Yeah, exactly. It would be the shame of the family too. Yeah. So Dicky feels like he's an inherently he's bad. He's wrong, as Cass does later on. So even though he's found a new life, and he's found the person he wants to be with, and he's found the person he wants to be himself. But then when Frank dies, everything gets scrambled, and Dicky makes this kind of, it's kind of like a Faustian pact, I guess, whereby Dicky wants to be good. He wants to be a good boy, and he's got this pull, within him between like being this person that being the person he could be, and staying in like academia or whatever it might be, and staying with Willie or not, or going back and fulfilling his father's plans, which are take over the business and, settle down with the family and just like repeat exactly what
try and have a normal life to a certain
the
degree, or
normal
what
life.
he thinks, that
exactly.
his family wants for him.
Be normal, and the lure of that, or the power of that image of like normality, is like, it's something that we all feel. We all want to sort of feel like, we fit in.
Totally.
And Dicky's he's very clever, but I don't think he's brave, and I don't think he's very, very strong. And the appeal of this image of goodness, of being like a good person in the eyes of the town, in the eyes of his father, there's lots of commendable aspects to what he does. So when he does take care of Elda, and he does raise a family, and he does care for them, and he does love them, and he does try and give them the best life he can. At the same time, it's always like he's acting, he's always like this kind of this version of himself that is like a Potemkin village or something like that. That's sort of, a kind of a distraction to the real person who he's kind of locked away deep inside him. And he thinks he can lock that side of himself away. And you can, like, people do go through their whole lives,
never really quite revealing their...
It's too hard, it's too hard. And they find themselves in with families, for instance. And there's so much goodness to that life that they've chosen that's a compromise that they feel they can make. And for Dicky, for a long time, it is a compromise that works. But when the garage disintegrates, and the person that he's, this kind of like image that he's built up of himself as, the good man who stepped up for his family, and he came back from Dublin and he took over the business, and he could have done all these great things, but he didn't. And that's because he's like just a solid individual. When the garage goes, all of that, the persona just sort of disintegrates with it. And suddenly he finds himself going, he doesn't know who he is. And he finds himself, when you get to middle age, like, you hit a point where you do sort of go, you see all these paths you could have taken, and you start thinking, what if I didn't? What if I've done that? It's like, it's a terrible idea to try and go back in time, But Dicky, again, like Cass, like, he's a clever man, but, clever people do stupid things like all the time. And he tries to go back and rediscover the person he was, and find Willie, and that doesn't work. It never does. I guess Dicky doesn't have much faith in love, He doesn't think that love is powerful enough to rescue him from this kind of like mess he's got himself in. And there's a moment quite late on where he thinks, like, where someone says to him, if you trust your family, if you trust them enough to just tell them who you are, if you love someone, then that's what you would do. And you would trust them to love you enough back to make a peace with that and find a way forward together. But he's not. He's just like, I guess one of the things I was interested in was how sort of the stories repeat through the generations. So Dicky's someone whose dad is quite, whose parents are both quite sort of difficult people who've got these kind of quite firm plans for who Dicky should be and how his life should be, and who Dicky actually is not super germane to these plans. It's not that important to the sense they want his life to be. So he's ended up becoming this people pleaser, because he doesn't really sort of feel that they value him in himself, So he's someone who doesn't feel that who he is ever good enough, which would horrify him if he knew it. But that kind of trickles down to Cass as well, She doesn't feel like she's good enough as the person who she is. She feels like she's got to kind of change herself and somehow become Elaine, and somehow become, just like do this kind of like 180 and
everyone's kind of craving this kind of unconditional love to just be accepted for who they are, but there is no like roots in that, There's a character called Victor, and Victor and Dicky's relationship is quite strange, I feel. Victor's quite odd. He's physically unappealing. He's got no charisma. He's a prepper who believes the end of the world is coming. And somehow Dicky is really drawn to him. What is the draw?
Yeah, Victor is a very, on the face of it, a very unappealing man. He's a builder. I don't know if you've ever had, a builder come to your house who you immediately feel this person should not be in possession of power tools, because they're just. That's Victor. Like his relationship with Dicky is based on he renovated the house at one point, and then he comes back to fix all the mistakes, and he just keeps coming back because the house keeps on sort of things keep going wrong. He's quite bad at what he does, but Dicky's drawn to him initially because Dicky's very interested in history. I think it's a part of like sort of Dicky's psychology. He feels so kind of. He's always worried about being exposed. He's always worried about being kind of found out for who he is. And I think that's tied into this obsession he has with like very dark elements of history, whereby like he's interested in like, genocides and atrocities and moments where like civilizations are wiped out. And Victor shares this interest in, apocalypse. So Victor's really interested in the end of the world, and he's kind of taking sort of like a action. So he's a prepper. He starts helping Dicky. He kind of woos Dicky into building this shelter in the woods, which Dicky can hide out. He can hide out there from the apocalypse with his family. And Victor's vision of the world is like a lot of preppers, is super dark. So Victor essentially feels that people are bad. So when apocalypse comes, all you can do is like just hide away, stock up with weapons, and just if anybody comes near you,
that's it. Yeah,
they're going to take from you. They're going to take your food, and they're going to suck up your whatever you need to survive. They're going to take away from it. So it's this really kind of zero sum approach to what it is to be a human being. And Dicky's not that kind of person, but he is drawn to like this viewpoint. Like he's got this sense that because he feels like someone who doesn't fit in, like underneath everything, he's someone who doesn't fit in. He's got this kind of sense that that the townsfolk who he deals with every day, and he's friendly with, he feels like the day may come when they will find out who he is and they'll come after him. So he's got this appeal. He senses there's an appeal to this kind of prepper lifestyle for him for these kind of reasons. Like at some level, he feels like that's all he can do to protect his family, because the world does seem like it's getting crazier and crazier. If you own a phone and you've just got like horror coming at you like every day,
constantly, yeah.
If you can withdraw, if you can find a pure space where it's just you and your family, and you can build a wall high enough, a part of you will think that like, well, that's a reasonable way of looking at things. Like that is just the only way you can do it. Is just cut off everybody else and just and forge your own path yourselves. Like realistically, I think that's a really dark way to look at things. But I can also see the appeal, and like Dicky sort of goes further and further down this road with this guy Victor. And I think what's secretly driving it is that like Dicky he's so lonely. He's just such a lonely man because he's got this wonderful family. He's got this amazing wife, but it's not his life in some ways, and his life is lost. It's like 20 years ago.
There are some big themes that I want to dig in a little bit more, and in particular, it's the shadow of climate change that I feel like really hangs over this novel. There's the floods and the drought, and Cass is having an existential crisis about how much the family car showroom has contributed to carbon emissions. Victor and Dicky, they're plotting this bunker and how to survive a climate apocalypse. To what extent is this like a climate change novel?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess when I was writing it, it felt like climate change wasn't something that was really addressed a lot in fiction. Now I think there's a genre. People talk about cli-fi. So I guess there's... Cli-fi,
this is my... I didn't know that.
I haven't actually read any of these cli-fi books, but I think it's... For me, it seemed like with Cass in particular, if I wanted to paint a realistic character of a teenager in the 21st century, it's something that I think the teenagers feel really viscerally, you know, the sense that the future is somewhere. I mean, it's heartbreaking, really. Like that's, you know, when I was a kid, you know, I grew up like thinking I had all my sort of various, you know, anxieties and fears and worries and so on. But I thought of the world as being like having a functioning future. Whereas if you're a teenager now and you're just watching, you know, adults continue to not do anything about this, like this existential threat, you know, that's going to annihilate nature. It's insane.
And kids are much more switched on now, I feel like, than before. Like, they know so much about the world. So I think it's completely right that you feel that they have such a knowledge and a worry on it.
I wanted Cass I wanted it to be sort of like front and center for Cass, you know, and that to be something that she not just thinks about, but that she sort of feels very deeply, which is to say that she feels like, you know, things that you know, Cass, she feels so guilty about so many things. It's quite Catholic in lots of ways, you know, but and climate change sort of feeds into that, whereby, you know, if you turn on your TV, you've contributed to climate change, or if you, let alone like drive your car down the street. So she feels really, really guilty about all that stuff. Like climate change, it's so difficult to write about because it is so huge and it is so hard to know what anyone can do about it. But I just wanted it to be there. I wanted it to be something that is in the background, because I feel like it is in the background. You know, every time I look at the news, it's you know, like the LA fires, for instance, you know, or Trump leaving the climate accords. You know, you're just watching this like roller coaster going straight down, and
totally. The
natural response is to try and just block it out, you know, and double down and say like, well, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. But in the book, I guess I wanted to try and think about, like, I guess there's two different ways you can think about it, which I wanted to go into in the book. So we've talked about Victor and this idea of prepping, and that's sort of like the nihilistic version of it, whereby you think, well, all I can do is like humanity is doomed, and all we can do is just get out. I'm going to build my own little, you know, bunker and hide away, and, you know, just if anyone comes near, I'm going to shoot them with my harpoon. I don't endorse that viewpoint. But then, like, so Willie, we re-encounter Willie quite late in the book, and he's become a politician, and he talks about climate change in a different way, and it kind of ties into what's happening with the family and the future the family could have. It's like, you know, what if we just dropped our masks and acted with some spirit of togetherness? You know, there's so much damage done by individualism and the need to kind of create a persona for yourself that's sort of impermeable to others. Like, and it works for some things, but it doesn't work for things like climate change, which are so vast that they really depend on people coming together and like just dropping their differences. Like, it's such a sort of trite thing to say, but it's true. You know, if we all stopped kind of, you know, machinating against each other, and work together, that would be like that's like the necessary first step to addressing climate change. And it's also the necessary first step for this family. Like, if they could just sort of be honest with each other, and go like, okay, like, here's where we actually are, here's who we really are, what are we going to do? Yeah. Maybe they could find a way forward. Like, there's always a way forward, but you've got to take this leap where you trust people enough to take off your mask. And it seems like that's a hard thing for people to do.
Totally. I mean, I want to say what a masterclass this book is in building tension. I mean, it's amazing how you build the tension, and the chapters become shorter and shorter, and the pages become faster and faster, and inevitably you're reaching a climax. I mean, it's genius. So I don't think I can put this off any longer, and we have to talk about the ending. And I'm not sure I even want to do this because I feel like I'm still so traumatized. But I definitely have to put up like massive spoiler alerts for anyone watching this. But after living with the Barnes family for 600 pages, I have to know, you know, is everyone going to be okay? Or did the thing I think happened? What can you tell me?
I get asked this quite a lot. I mean, it's funny,
sure.
like, it's not something that I thought was going to be like when I was writing the end of the book. I didn't think of it as something that people would kind of get so interested in or obsessed with, because it is something that does get discussed a lot. Okay, so I'll say two things. Like, so the first thing I would say is that I had this great tutor when I did a master's in creative writing, and I had this amazing tutor called Ellie Smith, who's just like an incredible writer and such a generous person as well. But she had this idea of like novels being kind of like a circle, and when you get to the end, you're back at the start, except everything's different. And in terms of structuring a novel, I've always found it like a really useful concept. Like in one way or another, like if you go back and look at some of the novels you love, and you look at the first line or the first paragraph, and then you skip to the last paragraph, you'll find that it's like this kind of micro novel where the whole story is told in those two things. So that was something that I was really thinking about with regard to the ending of The Bee Sting. So the ending, like, it just ends like, I guess, just like a hair, like a fraction of a second before, the event that, and I had several attempts at like adding like an epilogue. So it would be like, it would be like 5 minutes later, or it would be like an hour later, or it would be like a week later, or it would be like 5 years later. Like, someone would stumble into the clearing, or two people in the town would be discussing what happened, some ways down the line. Like, endings are important, and I think a lot of the time, like David Lynch talks about this a lot with Twin Peaks, how everybody, they thought they wanted to know who killed Laura Palmer, but in actuality, once you discover who kills Laura Palmer, that's sort of, it's kind of like, it kills the momentum, so yeah. The mystery in some ways is more powerful than the solution. And with this one, like every time I tried to put an epilogue in, and I spent so long, like right up to the end going, oh, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? And every time, no matter what I did, it always felt like a real gearing down. It felt like sort of, this is the high point, that moment with that line, the last line, that's the high point. And then if you sort of have an epilogue, it was just this, like, just all the tension was gone. And it felt unnecessary. It felt sort of superfluous in this really weird way. Like, I mean, so much of writing is about just your gut. And I'm sure you have the same choices as well, in music, where, there's no real way I can rationalize it. It just felt like that's the ending. It's got to be.
Yeah.
So, and everything I do after that is just, it feels like it's compromising it. And it feels like, although readers might feel like, I wish I knew what happened next, in actuality, if like there was an extra page, they go like, yeah, okay. It wouldn't be as good. That's the only way I
Okay,
can put
great.
it.
Well, you've successfully dodged my question. So, Paul, I want to say thank you so much for talking to me today. Having the chance to talk to you about these characters has been really, really special, and I've loved every moment.
What a joy to talk to you, and thanks so much for having me. It's such a thrill.
Thank you so much. And for anyone who wants more, they can go to service95.com, where you've given us a reading list and a playlist, as well as a guide to Ireland, following landmarks that you've used in this book. It's really fun, and I guess you could say it's kind of your love letter to Dublin.
It is.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. This has been really, really fun.
Thank you, dear. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks, Paul.